Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Tuesday, May 16th, 2023. President Joe Biden meets again with the bipartisan leadership of the House and Senate on raising the federal debt ceiling to avoid a default, with House Republicans still looking for spending cuts to be added, and the White House and Congressional Democrats pushing for a clean, standalone debt ceiling increase. Also today, House Speaker Kevin McCarthy telling reporters that putting in place work requirements for public aid programs like Medicaid and food stamps must be included. We'll have the latest in just a moment. Former executives of the Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank telling the Senate Banking Committee that the collapse of their banks caught them by surprise, but senators of both parties not buying it, accusing them of being greedy or, in one case, making a stupid mistake not to hedge against foreseeable trouble. Senate votes to overturn a Washington, D.C. policing reform law, joining the House, who had voted in April to pass this bill, but President Biden plans to veto it. The suspect in yesterday's baseball bat attack at the Fairfax County, Virginia district office of Congressman Gerald Connolly that injured two of his staffers appears in court, and the charges include hate crimes. And the CEO of OpenAI, the company that makes the artificial intelligence chatbot ChatGPT, telling a Senate Judiciary Subcommittee that he welcomes government regulation of this new, powerful, and potentially risky technology. We'll hear some of today's hearing and talk about it with a Washington Post technology policy reporter. President Biden meeting at the White House in the Oval Office with the Big Four, as they're known, of Congress, the Republican and Democratic leaders of the House and Senate. NBC News reports failure to reach an agreement to lift the borrowing limit threatens the first-ever default on the nation's $31.4 trillion debt, an outcome that could prove catastrophic for the U.S. economy and upend the political landscape. The president spoke very briefly before the meeting.
A good picture of all of us. We're having a wonderful time. Everything's going well. Anyway. I don't have any comment to make. We're just getting started. And will be available at the sticks when this is over.
Mr. President,
Thank you guys so much. Thank you so much.
Start of the White House Oval Office meeting with President Biden and the Republican and Democratic leaders of the House and Senate, none of them taking any of the reporters' shouted questions. After, the leaders did come out to what the president called the sticks, the microphones set up in the driveway. Associated Press reporting that crucial debt ceiling negotiations are still far from success, but a deal is possible by the end of the week. Republican House Speaker Kevin McCarthy said after a briefing Tuesday with President Joe Biden and other congressional leaders of the White House. Meanwhile, President Biden is cutting short his upcoming foreign trip because of the looming debt limit crisis, adding urgency to the talks. Here is House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, Republican from California, joined by the Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, Republican from Kentucky, with reporters after the meeting.
how'd it go in there, please?
I think we set the stage to carry on further conversations. You know, we only have 15 days really to go. We've got to find a way that we can curb our spending, raise our debt limit, and also grow our economy. And the president agreed to appoint a couple people from his administration to sit down and negotiate directly with my team, so I found that to be productive personally. But we've got a lot of work to do in a short amount of time. Now, I wish we had been able to be in this place 100 days ago. This is what we requested, but we are where we are, so we will work hard to make sure to try to have this become to fruition. Well, the great thing about that question is we've already have taken default off the table because the House Republicans passed a bill that raised the debt ceiling, limited our future spending, saved taxpayers money by being able to pull back unspent money and waste, and actually grow our economy by making our economy stronger and helping lifting people out of poverty into work. And so those are the parameters we'll talk about. Let me give a moment to have Leader McConnell say a few words.
Let me just say what I've said since February. The President and the Speaker are the keys to the deal. I'm prepared to try to deliver as much of my comments as I can. We're whatever the Speaker and the President can agree to, that we know will get us a
Speaker McCarthy, when will we meet again?
It's a no-brainer. I don't think anybody in America doesn't think if you had billions of dollars sitting out there that you appropriated 2 years ago, people could not spend, and it's hardworking taxpayers' money, and the pandemic is over, you can't bring it back. It's the only place in Washington that Democrats think you shouldn't do that. But I think at the end of the day, it will be in the bill.
Mr. Speaker, when will they meet again?
Yes,
A
sir.
lot of Americans watching this are probably wondering why on earth this is taking so long.
Yeah, I am too. You know, the difficult part here is I came February 1st to sit down with the president so we wouldn't be at this game. So how could we responsibly lift the debt ceiling? Our spending is out of control. That $6 trillion extra dollars the Democrats spent brought us inflation. How could we grow our economy and make us less dependent on China and actually work together? Unfortunately, for all those thinking that, for 97 days, the president ignored us and said we couldn't meet. It wasn't until the Republicans would no longer ignore the problem and actually raise the debt ceiling, pass a bill, did we finally get a meeting. It's unfortunate we are where we are, but the good thing about it is Republicans always look to find a solution.
Mr. Speaker, you said earlier this week that you were still very far apart.
We are.
You're still very far apart at this point.
Yes.
What progress was made at this meeting? And you wanted to see a deal by the end of the week.
Yes.
Do you think a deal could be possible?
It is possible to get a deal by the end of the week. It's not that difficult to get to an agreement. When you think about Limit, Save, Grow, the bill we passed, we raised the debt ceiling. We cap future spendings. We grow our spending in Congress by 1% each year. That gives you trillions of dollars of savings. We bring back money that we have already appropriated from the taxpayer that wasn't spent in a pandemic. We put in work requirements that the president voted for as a senator that in Wisconsin just a couple months ago passed by 82%. It lifts people out of poverty, put them into jobs. What that does is helps our supply chain. So no longer do we borrow money from China to pay people not to work. And the only thing we're talking about are able-bodied people with no dependents. That's all you're talking about. It's already in place in certain areas. And so then we make ourselves more energy independent. We change the red tape that we can actually build things in America. So the roads we want to build, the energy projects we want to build to become energy independent. So it lowers the price to Americans, but at the same time creates more jobs and the economy gets stronger.
House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, Republican from California, outside the White House, joined by the Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, Republican from Kentucky. After the meeting in the White House Oval Office with President Biden, Vice President Kamala Harris, and the Democratic leaders of the House and Senate, Majority Leader of the Senate Chuck Schumer and Minority Leader of the House Hakeem Jeffries, both from New York. And they also came out and spoke with reporters about how the meeting went.
Look, it was a good and productive meeting. Everyone agreed that default would be the worst outcome, a horrible situation for America and America's families. But we also agreed that we need to pass a bipartisan bill with bipartisan support in both chambers. I asked Speaker McCarthy, does he agree with that? And he said yes. And his bill, of course, is not a bipartisan bill. And so the bottom line is that we all came to agreement that we were going to continue discussions in the way that I believe Speaker McCarthy described, which was agreed to by all of us in the room together. And hopefully we can come to an agreement. We don't have much time, but default is just the worst alternative. And having a bipartisan bill in both chambers is the only way we're going to avoid default. Hakeem and I are committed to trying to get that bipartisan bill done.
It was a positive meeting. I thank the president for once again convening us. It was an open and an honest, but a very cordial discussion. We all agreed that the only path forward is to reach a bipartisan agreement anchored in common ground. We all agreed that default is not an acceptable option and must be avoided. And we all agreed that over the next few weeks we have to proceed with the fierce urgency of now in order to make sure we can reach that bipartisan, common sense, common ground agreement so that we can protect the health, the safety, and the economic well-being of the American people.
Can you guarantee
Yes,
there'll be
yes.
no default?
Yeah, we're not going to get into negotiations out here. We have to come to common ground. That's the only way this has ever gotten done. It has never gotten done with one party saying you have to do it my way. You have to get both parties in both houses together.
Senator
Yes.
McCarthy.
Well, you'll know it when you see it, and that what that means is that we'll not sacrifice our values. They'll probably not sacrifice their values, but we'll have to come together on something that can avoid default. Default is a disaster. Full stop. And everyone understood that in the room. I was glad to see that everyone understood what a disaster default was.
Senator.
You're closer to a deal today than you were a week ago. You said it's productive.
Yes,
closer
I
to
think
a deal.
it was, as the leader said, it was a much more cordial meeting. There were honest and real discussions about differences that we have on a whole variety of issues. But it was all respectful, and that was a good sign as well.
The Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Democrat from New York, joined by the House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, Democrat from New York, in the White House driveway after the meeting in the White House Oval Office with President Joe Biden, Vice President Kamala Harris, and the Republican leaders of the House and Senate talking about raising the debt ceiling. This morning, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen telling the Independent Bankers Association summit in Washington, D.C., it's essential Congress act as soon as possible to raise the debt limit because, as she put it, default would generate an economic catastrophe and the impacts of brinksmanship are already being felt.
Time is running out. Every single day that Congress does not act, we are experiencing increased economic costs that could slow down the economy. In 2011, we resolved the debt ceiling crisis right before the government had to stop making payments. But that 11th hour brinksmanship led to the first ever downgrade of our credit rating in history. Consumer confidence fell by over 20%. The S&P 500 plummeted by about 17%. Spreads for mortgages and auto loans widened, which generally makes it harder for households to afford houses and cars. And we're already seeing the impacts of brinksmanship. Investors have become more reluctant to hold government debt that matures in early June. And the impasse has already increased the debt burden to American taxpayers, as the leader of the Treasury Borrowing Advisory Committee said last week. Too many businesses, including yours, are having to spend your time planning around the potential risk of a U.S. default instead of thinking about longer-term investments that will grow your enterprises and boost the economy. And too many households are having to worry about how they will get by without the payments that the government has promised them and that these American families have earned. The U.S. economy hangs in the balance. The livelihoods of millions of Americans do too. So there's no time to waste. Congress should address the debt limit as soon as possible.
Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen today at the Independent Bankers Association summit in Washington, D.C. She has told Congress that the best estimate is, without an increase in the debt limit, the U.S. could default on its debt as early as June, possibly soon as June 1st. The Treasury Secretary just back from the G7 finance ministers meeting in Japan. The White House says that President Biden will go to the Group of Seven Summit Leaders Summit in Japan as scheduled this week, but will be canceling the second part of his originally planned trip, and that would be to Australia and Papua New Guinea. Wall Street today, the Dow down 336 and NASDAQ down 22, S&P down 26. From thehill.com, senators condemned former Silicon Valley Bank CEO Becker for dishing out bonuses and selling stock in the bank shortly before its collapse during Tuesday's Senate Banking Committee hearing. Throughout the hearing, Democrats and Republicans criticized SVB for growing too quickly and crafting compensation rules that rewarded executives for taking on excessive risk and refusing to hedge against the risk of rising interest rates. SVB loaded up on Treasury bonds that lost value when the Federal Reserve hiked interest rates to tackle inflation, which saddled the bank with massive unrealized losses. That reporting from thehill.com. C-SPAN covered this hearing, also testifying Scott Shea, former board chair of Signature Bank, another regional bank that recently collapsed. Here are the questions from the Senate Banking Committee Chair, Sherrod Brown, Democrat from Ohio.
Mr. Becker, your version of events blames SVB's failure on too many interest rate hikes, a social media-driven bank run, the closure of the much smaller Silvergate Bank, and the regulators for being slow to highlight its long-standing problems. It sounds a lot like the dog ate my homework. Your explanations ignore that your bank was without a chief compliant officer for the better part of a year. I don't think that was in your testimony. While you watched deposits leave and losses on long-term investment securities began to pile up, your version on that leaves out that you only tried to fix things when you were told that SVB was going to be downgraded. Is there any other explanation that you just wouldn't make any effort to fix the growing problems because it would have cut into earnings?
Chair Brown, we took risk management seriously, and we both were proactive in risk management and also were responsive to the regulatory feedback. And I think in the GAO report, it outlined the responsiveness that we had. And I think if you have an opportunity to talk to regulators that were directly involved, I think they would share that point of view. Regarding the chief risk officer, if I may add to that answer, we decided, the board and I, along with feedback from the regulators, that we were going to look for even more experienced CRO. And in my experience, it takes 6 to 9 months to find the best person for a role. We did 2 things to make sure that we had coverage while we were looking for a chief risk officer. First, we created an office of the CRO with the leadership team reporting to me and reporting to the chair of our risk committee. And secondly, we kept our chief risk officer on board as a consultant through October 1 to make sure there were no gaps during that period of time.
Mr. Shea, one of Signature Bank's fatal flaws was a concentrated depositor base that made it susceptible to a bank run. FDIC and New York banking regulators identified this as a problem. Signature Bank management assured them the bank's relationships and dedicated customer service would make customers less likely to flee. In the end, you bet on the hope that customers really valued that relationship, ignoring common sense risk management. The bank ended up with an extraordinary level of client concentration. The numbers, frankly, are hard to believe. 60 clients held 40% of total deposits, 4 depositors accounting for 14% of total deposits. Did you need that kind of concentration to make quick profits, Mr. Shea?
The bank took steps to offset and ameliorate the concentration of uninsured depositors. The bank set aside an internal allocation of liquidity in order to offset or in order to provide an internal collateral measure of maintaining high quality assets against uninsured deposits. In addition, the bank endeavored to diversify its deposit portfolio mix and maintain liquidity availability to offset those higher concentrations of assets.
Scott Shea, former board chair of Signature Bank, and former Silicon Valley Bank CEO Greg Becker, testifying before the Senate Banking Committee. The chair doing the questions there, Sherrod Brown, Democrat from Ohio. Republican Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana, also a member of the committee, questioned Greg Becker about SVB not hedging against the potential risk of having Treasury bonds that were worth less as interest rates increased.
Do hedges cost money?
Yes, they do.
And so if you bought hedges, you'd have less money, right?
Senator, it depends upon, yes, they would cost money, but it depends upon how the hedges
And if
were
you'd
structured.
made less money, that would have affected your bonus, wouldn't it?
Senator, our compensation was predominantly long-term in nature, and so I know there's been lots of discussions about compensation being short-term.
Mr. Becker, you made a really stupid bet that went bad, didn't you?
Senator,
and the taxpayers of America had to pick up the tab for your stupidity, didn't they?
Senator, there were a series of events, unprecedented events that occurred that led us to where we are today.
No, this wasn't unprecedented. This was bone deep, down to the marrow, stupid. You put all your eggs in one basket. You put all your eggs in one basket. And unless you were living on the International Space Station, you could see that interest rates were rising and you weren't hedged.
Senator John Kennedy, Republican from Louisiana, questioning Silicon Valley Bank former CEO Greg Becker at today's Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee hearing. We covered it, and you can find the full video at cspan.org. An Axios article on this hearing asks, what's next? And the answer, senators said they are trying to claw back executive compensation from leaders at both banks. Senator Elizabeth Warren, Democrat from Massachusetts, pointed to a bipartisan bill that proposes to do just that. The other witness coming from the failed Signature Bank. This is Washington Today. The Senate today joining the House in overturning a Washington, D.C. police reform law that was enacted after the 2020 murder of George Floyd that set off nationwide protests calling for changes into law enforcement policies and disciplinary procedures. President Biden plans to veto the bill, and the vote margins in the Senate and the House would not be enough to override the veto if no votes were changed. Here's Senator J.D. Vance, Republican from Ohio, in favor of this resolution on the Senate floor today.
The D.C. violent crime rate and the nonviolent crime rate has gone up way too quickly, in part because the D.C. City Council has passed a number of statutes and a number of laws that make it harder for police officers to do their job. I will not go through the laundry list of the act that we're dealing with here today and the number of ways in which it makes police less safe in doing their job and makes it more difficult, for them to do their jobs in the first place. But a few things in particular jump out. First of all, the law that we're trying to undo bans or severely restricts ordinary law enforcement practices, including the use of riot gear to disperse violent crowds. It makes it harder for police to actually give chase to violent offenders. And it also forces police to go through these ridiculous exhaustion requirements before they can use lethal force to protect themselves and people around them. This is why a number of DC police officers and organizations don't agree with this act. It's why they think that it makes them less safe, and it's why we have to go in a different direction in this community. I will close by saying that whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, whatever your politics are, we should be proud of this incredibly beautiful city. The people sent us here to do a job. They sent us here to do that job proudly, and it's hard to do it if we are surrounded by crime and we are surrounded by lawlessness. I want this to be the kind of place where Ohioans can come and visit, where they can walk the streets with their children without fear of their personal safety, and unfortunately, D.C. is going in the wrong direction. I yield the floor.
Senator J.D. Vance, Republican and sponsor of this resolution on the Senate floor. The final vote was 56-43. It passes, and it would overturn the D.C. law. 6 Democrats and 2 independents joining all Republicans in voting yes. The Democrats, Catherine Cortez Masto of Nevada, Maggie Hassan of New Hampshire, Joe Manchin of West Virginia, Jackie Rosen of Nevada, Jean Shaheen of New Hampshire, and John Tester of Nevada, and the 2 independents, Angus King of Maine and Kirsten Sinema of Arizona. The House passed this resolution in April by a vote of 229 to 189, with 14 Democrats joining the Republicans in voting yes. President Biden does plan to veto it, and an override of a veto takes a 2/3 vote of Congress. There are also some questions being raised about whether the Senate is acting too late. The Washington Examiner has an article. Under the Home Rule Act, all District of Columbia laws must undergo a 60-day review period during which Congress could block legislation from taking effect. That 60-day deadline passed on May 11th, meaning the Comprehensive Policing and Justice Reform Amendment Act is now district law, prompting local lawmakers to question whether it can be undone by Senator Vance's bill. That reporting from the Washington Examiner. From Associated Press, a man charged with attacking two staffers for Congressman Jerry Connolly with a baseball bat in his district office is also being charged with a hate crime, accused of damaging a car and chasing a woman in Virginia less than an hour earlier. Swan Ka Tran Pham, 49 years old of Fairfax, was arraigned Tuesday by video hookup from the Fairfax County Jail. He refused to appear, so a judge read the 4 counts against him while he huddled under a blanket in his cell. The charges include aggravated wounding and malicious aggravated wounding for the baseball bat attack on 2 staffers at Congressman Connolly's district office in Fairfax. They also include a misdemeanor hate crime charge and a felony count of destroying property. That from AP. CNN's Manu Raju, a Capitol Hill reporter, tweeting that House Speaker Kevin McCarthy this morning non-committal about providing more money for member security at district offices. I would have to look at all that. I always have to get all the facts before making a decision, a quote from Kevin McCarthy. Manu Raju included a minute of his interview with Congressman Connolly, who's calling for additional security.
This individual caused mass destruction in your office, too.
Yeah, after he was denied access to more staff members he could hurt, he turned his fury on the office itself, and a lot of broken glass, destroyed computers, some furniture. I haven't been able to get there because it's a crime scene.
We've seen this happen with Nancy Pelosi's house, Steve Scalise shooting. I mean, what does this tell you about how vulnerable members of Congress are?
I think we're going to have to reassess the security we provide or don't provide district offices. So if you're a member of Congress and your office happens to be in the federal building, the courthouse, you're going to have security. But if you're in a commercial office space like me, you have no security, none. And what could go wrong with that? Well, we learned the answer to that question this morning.
Congressman Gerald Connolly, Democrat from Virginia, interviewed by CNN reporter Manu Raju, who tweeted that video. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy did speak about the attack on the staff of Congressman Connolly Monday night.
Thank you all for being here today. And before we begin, I first want to begin by addressing the heinous attacks that happened to Congressman Connolly's district office today. I did put a call into the Congressman, the chair, and the staff members. We are all praying for the quick recovery of the staffers injured and grateful for the quick actions of the law enforcement who apprehended the suspect.
House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, Republican from California, Monday night at the start of a House Republican news conference talking about National Police Week. Today, the House Democratic Caucus Chair, Pete Aguilar, also of California, talked about the attack.
First, I wanted to just, on behalf of House Democrats, let everyone know that we are in constant communication with Jerry Connolly. A lot of us reached out to him via text and via calls yesterday, but the violence that ensued at his district office, and making sure that he and his staff know that we're all in this with them, and we want to do everything we can to help them. But it was something that was quite jarring to all of us who have district offices and staff whose responsibility it is oftentimes the difficult task of making us look good. They do such an amazing job, and so our thoughts are with Jerry and his team.
The House Democratic Caucus Chair, Pete Aguilar of California, at a news conference today. More from the Associated Press article. Congressman Connolly said his staffers, an intern was struck in the side and an outreach director was hit on the head, were released after hospital treatment. Since the January 6, 2021 attack on the Capitol, threats to lawmakers and their families have increased sharply. And the suspect in the attack tells the Washington Post his son was diagnosed with schizophrenia and has dealt with mental illness since his late teens. Congressman Robert Garcia, Democrat from California, today introduced a resolution to expel Congressman George Santos, Republican from New York. Congressman Santos was recently indicted on 13 federal criminal charges, including wire fraud, money laundering, and lying to Congress. He's pleaded not guilty. Congressman Garcia spoke today on the House floor.
Pursuant to Clause 2A1 of Rule 9, I rise to give notice of my intent to raise a question of the privileges of the House. The form of the resolution is as follows. House Resolution 114. Resolved that pursuant to Article 1, Section 5, Clause 2 of the Constitution of the United States, Representative George Santos be, and he hereby is, expelled from the House of Representatives. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Under Rule 9, a resolution offered from the floor by the member other than the majority leader or the minority leader as a question of privilege of the House has immediate precedent only at a time designated by the chair within 2 legislative days after the resolution is properly noticed. Pending that decision, the form of the resolution noticed by the gentleman from California will appear in the record at this point. The chair will not, at this point, determine whether the resolution constitutes a question of privilege. That determination will be made at the time designated by the consideration of the resolution.
Congressman Mike Bost, Republican from Illinois, in the Speaker's chair, and the resolution offered from Congressman Robert Garcia, Democrat from California. The motion is privileged, so House Republicans will have 2 days to schedule a vote. As for their options, there's an article at thehill.com. Speaker McCarthy can either call a motion to table or refer the resolution to the Ethics Committee, both of which would require a simple majority vote, or bring the expulsion resolution to the floor, which needs a 2/3 vote to pass. Washington Today continues in a moment.
Live Wednesday at 10 a.m. Eastern on C-SPAN Radio. U.S. Postmaster General Louis DeJoy testifies about Postal Service reform before a House Oversight Subcommittee. And live Wednesday at 2 p.m. Eastern, a federal court case on access to the abortion pill, Muffapristone. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals will hear a challenge to a district court judge's ruling, invalidating the FDA's approval of the abortion pill 2 decades ago. Listen to C-SPAN Radio anywhere on the C-SPAN Now app or on your smart speaker. Say, play C-SPAN Radio.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts and on the C-SPAN Now mobile app. From Reuters, the CEO of OpenAI, the startup behind ChatGPT, told a Senate panel on Tuesday the use of artificial intelligence to interfere with election integrity is a significant area of concern, adding that it needs regulation. The article continues, for months, companies large and small have raced to bring increasingly dexterous AI to market, throwing endless data and billions of dollars at the challenge. Some critics fear the technology will exacerbate societal harms, among them prejudice and misinformation, while others warn AI could end humanity itself. Here is part of today's Senate Judiciary Subcommittee hearing. Senator Josh Hawley, Republican from Missouri, questioning OpenAI CEO Sam Altman.
If these large language models can, even now, based on the information we put into them, quite accurately predict public opinion, ahead of time, predict, it's before you even ask the public these questions, what will happen when entities, whether it's corporate entities or whether it's governmental entities or whether it's campaigns or whether it's foreign actors, take this survey information, these predictions about public opinion, and then fine-tune strategies to elicit certain responses, certain behavioral responses. We already know, this committee has heard testimony, I think 3 years ago now, about the effect of something as prosaic, it now seems, as Google search, the effect that this has on voters in an election, particularly undecided voters in the final days of an election who may try to get information from Google search, and what an enormous effect the ranking of the Google search, the articles that it returns, has come an enormous effect on an undecided voter. This, of course, is orders of magnitude, far more powerful, far more significant, far more directive, if you like. So, Mr. Altman, maybe you can help me understand here what some of the significance of this is. Should we be concerned about large language models that can predict, survey opinion, and then can help organizations, entities fine-tune strategies to elicit behaviors from voters? Should we be worried about this for our elections?
Yeah. Thank you, Senator Hawley, for the question. It's one of my areas of greatest concern, the more general ability of these models to manipulate, to persuade, to provide sort of one-on-one interactive disinformation. I think that's like a broader version of what you're talking about, but given that we're going to face an election next year and these models are getting better, I think this is a significant area of concern. I think there's a lot of policies that companies can voluntarily adopt, and I'm happy to talk about what we do there. I do think some regulation would be quite wise on this topic. someone mentioned earlier, it's something we really agree with. People need to know if they're talking to an AI, if content that they're looking at might be generated or might not. I think it's a great thing to do, is to make that clear. I think we also will need rules, guidelines about what's expected in terms of disclosure from a company providing a model that could have these sorts of abilities that you talk about. So I'm nervous about it. I think people are able to adapt quite quickly. When Photoshop came onto the scene a long time ago, for a while people were really quite fooled by Photoshopped images, and then pretty quickly developed an understanding that images might be Photoshopped. This will be like that, but on steroids. And the interactivity, the ability to really model, predict humans well, as you talked about, I think is going to require a combination of companies doing the right thing, regulation, and public education.
Sam Altman, OpenAI CEO, questioned by Senator Josh Hawley, ranking Republican on the Judiciary Subcommittee on Privacy, Technology, and the Law. Washington Post technology policy reporter Kat Zakreski joins us now with more on today's hearing. Thank you so much for being with us. This was different than a lot of recent congressional hearings with leaders of tech companies. Sam Altman is inviting the government to regulate his industry. What reasons did he give for that?
Sam Altman delivered a sober account of the ways that artificial intelligence, in his words, can cause significant harm to the world. And he talked about a variety of ways that could happen, whether that's spreading false information or influencing voters in the lead up to elections. He talked about the risks of AI weapons and how AI could be even used to target drone strikes. And so given these, catastrophic risks that he laid out, he talked about, in order to kind of capture the benefits of AI and ensure that this could be, more of a printing press type moment in tech innovation rather than a atomic bomb type moment like lawmakers are worried about. He talked about the need for regulation and industry leaders like himself to work with lawmakers. And like you said, that elicited a completely different response and atmosphere, I think, in the hearing room than what we've become accustomed to with these tech CEO hearings that are often quite combative. If anything, I think lawmakers came off as very receptive to some of these proposals and genuinely interested in some of his ideas about how to regulate this burgeoning technology.
As the senators were questioning Sam Altman, what policy areas did they bring up potential concerns about how AI could be misused intentionally or unintentionally?
So, Senator Josh Hawley raised concerns about how AI could be misused to influence voters, specifically undecided voters in the critical days leading up to an election. Sam Altman, talked about how that's one of the areas that he's most concerned about. And he raised, the specter of what he called, quote, one-on-one interactive disinformation and emotional manipulation. You saw Senator Amy Klobuchar raise concerns about effectively how this technology might be disruptive to local news and further exacerbate some of the concerns there. Senator Blumenthal saying that his biggest concern is the way that AI could potentially disrupt the job market. That was one area where I thought Altman kind of painted perhaps a bit of a rosy picture, talking about, the ways that AI could potentially improve jobs and create new great jobs for people. And so really, what we saw is that there's a wide range of concerns among lawmakers about what potential this technology might have. And although, there were some ideas presented in this hearing, specifically from Altman and one of the other witnesses, Gary Marcus, around creating new agencies tasked with regulating AI, we're still not really seeing Congress coalesce around a specific solution. They're really just starting to get their hands around the problem.
We're talking with Kat Zakreski from the Washington Post. Following up on that, as they sort of approach regulation of AI, what challenges would they face with this particular technology?
Well, so one thing that we've seen over the past half decade or so is that Congress has really struggled to regulate the tech industry. I think since the fallout of the 2016 election, there's been this building momentum, especially on Capitol Hill, to regulate these tech giants. And that's manifested in a variety of ways. We've seen Democrats pushing for legislation to address disinformation spread on these platforms. We've seen efforts from both parties to pass consumer privacy legislation. And then, we've also seen all of the antitrust push and efforts to create new competition laws. And none of those efforts have gone anywhere on Capitol Hill. Most of them have not even made it to, the House or Senate floor for a vote. And so I think the question is whether Congress will be able to overcome several things in order to regulate AI. The first is partisan divisions. I think there's broad concerns about this technology, but what we've seen with past attempts to regulate the tech industry is that there are partisan divisions that emerge over what the solution is. One area we might see that is in this debate over whether we need a new government agency, whether Republicans wary of, big government might get on board with that. The other thing that we've often seen with attempts to regulate the tech industry is intense corporate lobbying. Although you have Sam Altman supportive of some of these ideas, where will the other big players in this space, the Googles, the Metas, the Amazons of the world, come down on such proposals, and how will they leverage their machines in Washington to potentially oppose or support that? And then the third question is just competing priorities. I think often when we're talking about these issues with the tech industry, some of the debate is a bit forward-looking, and it's difficult for lawmakers to prioritize that day-to-day when other issues come up related to the economy and jobs that they're seeing more present-day effects from.
Kat Zakreski, Washington Post technology policy reporter. Find her stories at WashingtonPost.com. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having me on the show.
More Washington reaction today to the release Monday of the Durham Report from Special Counsel John Durham that criticized the FBI for opening an investigation into possible ties between President Donald Trump's or candidate Trump's 2016 presidential campaign and Russia, and opening it based upon what the Durham Report calls raw, unanalyzed, and uncorroborated intelligence. Also saying the FBI failed to act on a clear warning sign that the agency was being targeted by Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign to manipulate or influence the law enforcement process for political purposes. Congressman Mike Johnson, Republican from Louisiana, speaking to reporters this morning.
Hey, Congressman, how are you? I'm wondering your initial thoughts, obviously, with the Judiciary Committee on the Durham reports and what we can expect from a hearing potentially.
The Durham report confirms what we've known for a long time and have been talking about. There was no predicate whatsoever for the so-called Russia collusion hoax, and now the evidence is shown clearly. It's a 300-page report. We commend every American to read it. I think it'll be alarming to them as it is to us.
Democrats seem to be saying this is a nothing burger, largely.
Of course they're going to say that because it indicts the entire Democratic Party, the Hillary Clinton campaign, who is behind all of that, and some of the key characters in the FBI that really abuse their positions and really have done great harm to the institution itself.
Congressman Mike Johnson, Republican from Louisiana, member of the Judiciary Committee, speaking with reporters on Capitol Hill. The chair of that committee has invited John Durham to testify about the report. This afternoon, a request for comment to the White House Press Secretary, Karine Jean-Pierre.
What is the White House reaction to Special Counsel Durham's report on how the FBI handled the Trump-Russia probe?
I would leave it to the Department of Justice to speak to.
The President talks often about how he wants the DOJ and FBI to remain independent and above the fray. That report seems to reflect the opposite. Does he agree with Special Counsel Durham that there needs to be wholesale changes at the FBI?
Again, that is with the Department of Justice. That's not something that I'm going to speak from the podium. As you just stated in your question, we believe in an independent Department of Justice. That's what the President said when he was running, and that's what the President has said the last 2 years.
White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre at her briefing. U.S. relations with Russia and also China coming up today at a Senate Appropriations Committee hearing with Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, and Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo, all testifying. Senator Lindsey Graham, Republican from South Carolina, asking them about the U.S. response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine and how that might relate to China's potential invasion of Taiwan.
Secretary Austin, I've been telling my constituents in South Carolina that if we fold in Ukraine and let Putin have his way with the Ukraine, China's more likely to invade Taiwan. Do you agree with that?
I agree, Senator, and not only China, but we'll see other bad actors around the world try to do the same.
I couldn't agree with you more. So how we deal with other bad actors in the world matters. Do you believe our disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan emboldened our enemies, Secretary Austin?
Senator, as you know, there were three things that happened in Afghanistan.
I don't have time for three things. Do you believe it emboldened our enemies? And if you don't, you've missed a lot.
I don't, Senator.
Okay, good. Well, you've missed a lot. Secretary Blinken, you said a couple of months ago that China was on the verge of supplying lethal aid to Russia. Was that accurate when you said it?
It was, Senator.
Okay. We all agree we want China not to help Russia, right? Here's an idea. 100 U.S. senators recommended to you that we declare Russia a state sponsor of terrorism to deter people like China from giving them weapons. Here we are, months later, and nothing's happened. And, Ms. Secretary, I like you a lot, but you're never going to designate Russia a state sponsor of terrorism, are you?
Never say never.
Well, I can pretty well say China sees all talk here. If you're really worried about China giving weapons to Russia, instead of picking up the phone and calling the Chinese, please don't do that, why don't you get 100 U.S. senators to pass a law telling China, if you give them one bullet, we're going to sanction the hell out of you.
Senator, could I just add to that, if I may?
Yes, please, very quickly.
I think China has taken account of the...
So do you think they've been deterred?
Of the unprecedented sanctions and export controls that we have wielded against Russia.
So you think making Russia a state sponsor of terrorism would not send a stronger signal to China, don't help the Russians?
I think the authorities that we have and we've used, which accomplish the same thing, have been very effective.
Okay,
let's send a clear message to China.
Yeah, let's go to Iran. Is Iran a state sponsor of terrorism under U.S. law? Madam Secretary.
Sorry.
Yes, I believe it is.
Okay, they're sanctioned to the hilt, right?
Yes.
Okay, do you realize that Iran's oil revenue went up 20% last month?
I know it's gone up.
Yeah, it's gone up 20% every month. Why? Because of China. So this idea that we have a strong China policy is a bunch of crap. It's not the budget will deter China. It's our will to take on people like China. So I think we're in a real world of hurt.
Senator Lindsey Graham, Republican from South Carolina, questioning the Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, and Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin at today's Senate Appropriations Committee hearing. The focus of the hearing mostly on U.S. competitiveness with China. South China Morning Post reports that the U.S. Justice Department said on Tuesday it had charged a former Apple Incorporated engineer with attempting to steal the firm's technology related to autonomous systems, including self-driving cars, and then fleeing to China. The case was among 5 announced on Tuesday aimed at countering alleged efforts to illicitly acquire American technology by nations, including Russia, Iran, and China. 2 of the cases involve what Justice Department officials called procurement networks created to help Russia's military and intelligence services obtain sensitive technology. A former employee of the U.S. consulate in Russia, which has since been closed, Robert Shonov, has been arrested and charged with, according to the Russian state-run news agency TASS, collaboration on a confidential basis with a foreign state or international or foreign organization. State Department spokesperson Vedant Patel asked about it today in Washington.
Do you have anything to add to the statement that you guys put out earlier on the ex-consulate employee in Vladivostok who was arrested?
I don't have anything additional. You saw the statement that we put out. We strongly condemn the reports of the arrest of Robert Shonov, a former employee of the U.S. mission in Russia. These allegations against Mr. Shonov are wholly without merit. As you saw in the statement we put out at the time of his arrest, his role was largely centered around supporting the press and public affairs operations. So again, these allegations are just wholly without merit. Mr. Shronov is a Russian national who was employed by the Consulate General for more than 25 years. And after Russia forced the termination of our locally employed staff, he was employed by a company that was contracted to provide services to the embassy in Moscow. And that was done in strict compliance with Russian laws and regulations.
Okay. Well, did the Russians tell you about this? How do you know? How do you know about this?
The thing, Matt, as you know, is that he is a Russian citizen, and so we were not notified of his arrest and do not have the ability to visit or communicate with him. I'm not going to get into specifics of how we stayed in touch, but we, of course, were not notified of this arrest.
State Department spokesperson Vedant Patel questioned by Associated Press reporter Matt Lee at today's briefing. CNN has this, according to TASS, the state-run news agency in Russia. Robert Shronov is being held in Moscow's Lefortovo prison, the same facility where wrongfully detained American journalist Evan Gershkovich is being held, and a court date has not been set. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. Sign up for C-SPAN's evening newsletter word for word to get the stories Washington is talking about sent to your inbox every day. Subscribe at c-span.org/connect. Have a good night.